Hi, the following video was shot over a year ago and was edited with absolutely minimal effort. It still took me hours to do. I couldn't care less. Here's some lo-fi music from my buddy Kevin to spruce it up. Hit it. This is the RTX 4090. A year and a half after its release, it's still the most powerful consumer level card on the market. And it's still pretty expensive. So we're going to take mine apart. Put a little water block on it, and hope I don't invalidate the warranty. My coworker and I were working gigs across the country from each other on drop day, and we're texting back and forth availability updates from Amazon, Newegg, B&H, etc. We both ended up getting one. But of course I had, grander plans of water cooling it and, taking my bleeding edge setup even further. So that's the purpose of this video, to show us tearing down the graphics card, implementing the GPU water block, and then implementing the entire Watercool system. Also, shout out to my homie AJ for coming through and advising me through this entire nerve-wracking experience. As you can expect, stakes are high when you're dealing with taking apart an $1,800 card and water cooling a rig that's all highest-end flagship components. This was my first Watercool build, and he's got a ton of experience building custom loops. So this is the card. As you can see, it is pretty large, which is a big deal whenever it comes to form factor. It's arm for size there, I didn't have a banana, sorry. But yeah, form factor is a big factor here and has been a big factor for a lot of owners of 40 series cards just because, they buy one and they don't have a case big enough. So the first order of business is going to be getting the back plate off along with the little tension bracket that keeps tension on the GPU chip to the heatsink below. There's a lot of screws here, a lot of small screws that go in very specific places, so it's important, that we remember where they go just in case I decide to sell the card later and upgrade. We've got a nice little magnetic cup there to hold all those in place so I don't spill them everywhere, of course. Alright, back plate is off. As you can see, they've got little thermal pad strips there on the plate itself. And then we unplug all the fan headers and the RGB headers. Once those are unplugged, we'll remove the PCIe I/O bracket. It's worth noting that EK originally included a smaller 2-slot bracket on the GPU parts list. However, sometime in between pre-order and receiving the block, they took it off. This is a big deal because the stock bracket is 3 full slots and hamstrings where I convert mount the card in my case. Now we're ready to separate the card from the heatsink. To do this, I'll warm it up with a heat gun to make the thermal compound holding the GPU chip to the base nice and soft. Then we'll gently wiggle it off. It's incredibly important that I don't mess this up. MSI cannot invalidate my warranty for disassembling the card. That's actually against the law. However, if I damage the card in the process, I'm kind of SOL. And now for the moment of truth. We put that little cover on the PCIe, and then we're just going to wiggle and not pull up too hard because we don't want the GPU chip to accidentally, separate from the PCB even the slightest bit. And the surgery is a success. We have successfully separated the entire PCB from the heatsink block, and we can go ahead and get started on cleaning it up and putting thermal pads on. As you can see, there's a lot of thermal paste there, a lot more than you're going to see on a CPU specifically, and we need to get that off. So we're going to get some 95% or 91% isopropyl alcohol and very carefully clean up around it. The chip is actually the easiest to clean up, but there is quite a bit that's just kind of caked up around the connections around it, and that's where it gets a little tricky. At this point, I'm just doing some fine cleaning around the connections with tweezers while AJ preps the GPU block. This is the Quantum Vector Trio 4090 nickel and plexi block from EKWB, a Slovenian company that has a reputation for being one of the premier manufacturers of PC water cooling parts. The machining on the contact plate is incredibly intricate and requires a variety of size, thickness thermal pads in very specific places. EK includes all the thermal pads you need in their kit, however I sprung for Gela GP Ultimate thermal pads. These pads may only make a couple of degrees difference, but these sort of marginal differences add up at each component level to make a significant upgrade over less machines. The placement of these pads is of utmost importance and can create a potential nightmare situation if you don't follow the map provided by EK exactly. This means cutting them to size and verifying the thickness of the pads you're putting down. Putting a 1.5 or 2mm pad down in the spot that requires a 0.5 millimeter thickness can prevent components around it from making proper contact with the block. You could go through all the trouble to put the card and your entire loop together only to power up and find that you have VRAM modules overheating. Now it's time to apply thermal paste. I'm going to put a big ol' X of Cryonaut Thermal Grizzly on there. If it's good enough for overclocking Legend or Bower, it should be great for my use case. I'll do one more quick pass just to make sure all thermal pads are laying flat and accounted for before applying the cooling block. Now we'll secure the PCB to the cooling block with screws before prepping the backplate with thermal pads. The backplate is significantly easier with cutouts that make it easy to see where the pads go. It's worth noting that EK offers active cooling backplates for 40 series cards, meaning there would be cooling blocks on both sides. When the 3090 was released, half of the 24GB of VRAM modules were located on the back of the card. This led to warmer modules on those cards than optimal. Thus, the active backplate was born. MSI remedied this on their 40 series cards by putting all 24GB on the front of the card, so the active backplate is not necessary here. With the backplate finished, we can close up the GPU and start tackling the loop itself. As seen below, my EK Quantum Velocity AM5 nickel and plexi CPU block is already firmly mounted to my MSI X670E godlike motherboard. I also have two quantum surface radiators mounted in the case, sized 420 and 360mm. Leon Lee Unifans are already mounted to those, but I would later swap those for the upgraded SL Infinity models. It's time to start filling out the case. We'll mount the motherboard to the chassis and then start working on case headers and SATA plugs. The EATX form factor provided significant challenges to the build as the extra width often covered cable grommets and interfered with side panel fan mounting in some cases. The Corsair IQ7000X was the only case I found that played nice enough with my desired 2 radiator config. Even still, the quote-unquote premium 90-degree angle 24-pin power connector was impossible to plug into if coming through the grommets. I ended up bringing that cable from underneath the board, which looks like ass, but it was a solution. Another form factor issue was the GPU riser cable. In lieu of a GPU vert mount adapter, Corsair put standoff holes on top of the power supply shroud to attach the riser cable to. Unfortunately, it was designed to fit with only Corsair riser cables, and at time of build they only offered a PCIe 3.0 option. In order to avoid a GPU bottleneck, I went through 3 different Gen 4 riser cables before settling on a cable mod one with extendable screw holes that I still had to take a tiny knife to whittle down far enough to reach both standoffs. AJ and I are now going to install the pump. It's an EK Quantum Kinetic 300ml D5 pump res combo. I wanted to make sure I had the max amount of coolant I could throw at this build to keep heat saturation and the coolant down. To mount it, I've got a holder that's designed to screw into any 120mm fan mount. It was a little tough to get on around the fan, but trust me, it would have been harder to take the fan off and then put it back on around the holder. It's time to install the GPU. The riser cable goes in fairly smoothly, but as I mentioned before, there are form factor hurdles to get over. The alignment of the PCIe slot on the riser didn't quite play nice with the case PCIe mount, so I ended up loosening the right riser mount so the GPU could properly mount to the case first and then retighten the riser. All that's left is to reinstall the top radiator and the rear exhaust fan, and then it's on to building the loop. Of course, the fans are plenty thick, so to get the 90 and 45-degree adapter fittings around the fans, we've got small threaded extenders pre-installed. Unfortunately, this is where we really hit a snag. The hard tubing fittings I bought from EK had dried out O-rings that are integral to preventing leaks. Furthermore, the machining was so bad that AJ and I both ended up with tiny cuts all over our fingers and thumbs after handling them. With EK being based out of Slovenia, waiting for replacements wasn't exactly an option. I wasn't about to have my PC out of commission for 3 weeks while I waited for the parts. In the moment it was incredibly frustrating, but honestly it made things easier in the end. Hard tubing is incredibly difficult to implement due to the amount of precision cutting and bending that must be done. Regardless, this was all we could finish in day 1 with the parts on hand, and AJ had to head back to Houston. It's day 2 with the build and I've got solutions in hand. AJ is gone, so I'm on my own for the final stretch, but things are now much easier than the original hard tubing plan. I've switched to soft tubing from Corsair with soft tubing fittings that match the threading of the EK fitting adapters already in place, so everything is compatible. The soft tubing setup is very straightforward. Connect one end, lead it to the next fitting, and cut with scissors. No acrylic hacksaw or file for smoothing needed. This will also make loop maintenance way easier for regular draining and cleaning of the loop. The cooling configuration order is as follows: pump to GPU, GPU to top rad to CPU, CPU to side rad back to pump. Most conventional loop building wisdom states that the order really doesn't matter, but it still made me feel better staggering my radiators between each cooled component. Once the tubing is completed and all fittings are thoroughly checked and tightened, it's time to test for leaks. While there are more technically adept options in the market, the EK leak tester gets the job done. I'll connect the tube to the top of the reservoir that goes to a small air pump with a PSI gauge. I'll pump air into the loop until the gauge hits about 0.3 bar and close the pressure valve. If the gauge doesn't drop after about 15 minutes of sitting, it's probably safe to introduce coolant to the loop. To prep the system for coolant, I cover up sensitive components below the connections with paper towels in the event that the coolant starts leaking from a fitting. The pump is plugged into the PSU and a 24-pin jumper is plugged into the main motherboard power to trick the PSU into turning on when I flip the switch. For coolant, I'm using the Cloud White EK Cryo Fuel to provide a neutral aesthetic to whatever color palette I choose for the RGB. Cryofuel has anti-corrosive agents that are important for the health of any loop that's mixing metals. However, the metal combination of nickel block and copper radiator that I'm using should not pose any threat to its integrity. If I were using brass radiators, I could do significant damage to my system as the resulting corrosion would build up in the pump and destroy it, leaving the CPU and the GPU to overheat. Finally, the moment of truth. I fill up the reservoir with coolant and turn the pump on to start filling up the loop. When filling the loop, it's important to not let the pump run dry as that can wear it down, so I probably should have turned it off faster since I was limited by how fast I could pour through the funnel. Regardless, the loop held and no leaks were found. Generally speaking, you should leave the pump running overnight once the pump is filled just to be sure. However, I think I only ran it for 4 hours. This is also useful for working out any air bubbles that might be present in the blocks or the radiators. I went through nearly 2-liter bottles of coolant here. With 2 full-size rads and a 300 milliliter reservoir to fill, there's a lot of space. And there you have it. The build is complete and I'm pretty satisfied with how it turned out. I started building PCs in 2013 and I've always wanted to build a bleeding edge rig, so this one is definitely a dream build for me. This was by far my most challenging build, not just in terms of piecing it all together, but in finding the components that would work well together without compromising my goal of using the highest quality flagship parts. There's so much to think of when building out a PC, and tools like PC Part Picker can only do so much to predict the compatibility of your components. With all this in mind, let's talk specs. For the CPU, I originally installed an AMD Ryzen 9 7950X, but when AMD released an X3D variant of the 16-core flagship processor in April, I just had to get it. The 7950 X3D features an extra stacked V cache of 128 megabytes on the first CCD and actively communicates with Xbox Game Bar to park the 8 cores on the other CCD when you boot up a game. This allows the CPU to devote more resources to the cores that you will actually be using when gaming, but with the versatility to still handle multitasking and all-core workloads when you need it for productivity. For the motherboard, I went all out with the MSI Meg X670E Godlike. It's way overkill and still the most expensive board in its class. Sporting way more power stages than anyone will ever use, excellent VRM thermals, PCIe Gen 5 and Gen 4 lanes for days, and a solid amount of I/O, this board is the absolute pinnacle of MSI's Meg series AM5 motherboards. For RAM, I'm using 64 gigs of G-Skill Trident Z5 Neo 6000 MHz. I originally started with two 16GB sticks, added another two sticks, and successfully overclocked them in quad channel mode to 6000 MHz, albeit with some instability. Unfortunately, when I uninstalled the added RAM, I didn't reseat the remaining 32GB and caused some issues that led to boot hangups for a while. I eventually replaced these with the two 32GB sticks that I have now. As you already know, the GPU is the MSI Gaming Trio RTX 4090. I've already gone into detail about the card, but my only complaint here is that MSI capped the power draw at 480 watts, and even their Trio X and Supreme cards only go to 490 watts. This limits the overclocking ability of the GPU compared to cards from Asus and Gigabyte that can pull all the way up to 600 watts. For storage, I've got all Samsung with a 980 Pro 2TB NVMe for boot drive, a 980 Pro 1TB for extra storage, and an Evo 2TB SATA SSD drive with all my backed up files and music from my old computer. I'm patiently waiting for Samsung to finally release a Gen 5 NVMe so I can try out direct storage technology. The power supply is an EVGA Supernova 1600 watt T2. The T2 is a titanium rated power supply, the highest designation of efficiency given by the 80+ ratings board. I originally wanted an ATX 3.0 power supply for the benefit of the direct 12 volt high power connectors that communicate with the GPU to determine more accurate power needs, but those were not released prior to this build and would make a very little difference compared to what I have. The case is a Corsair iQ 7000X. It was pretty much this or the 7000D Airflow model. Case and motherboard manufacturers have done a poor job building a case that properly caters to the EATX form factor. Considering EATX boards are supposed to be the premium line products, you'd think that there would be better cases for them. I really wish I could have used the highly modular Thermaltake P8, but I digress. The 7000X has done me well anyway. All the custom cabling came from CableMod, including the 12-volt high-powered triple 8-pin adapter. If you know, you know. For fans, I'm using the Leon Lee SL Infinity fans, literally the coolest fans on the market in form and functionality. They daisy chain signal by clipping into each other and can send animations up and down the entire chain. How cool is that? My keyboard and mouse setup is a Roccat Iscu Force FX Plus and Corsair M65 RGB Elite. The keyboard is just an upgraded version of the Iscu I got with my first PC in 2013, and the M65 Elite is just as good as I could find to replace my beloved Rat 7. Rest in peace, man. And to round everything out, the monitors. My main display is a Samsung Odyssey Neo G8, which is a 32-inch 4K 240Hz 1000R curved monitor with up to 2000 nits peak brightness and excellent HDR. And then up top, I've got a wall-mounted LG C1 48-inch OLED 120Hz TV. The OLED is kind of insane. If you haven't experienced one yet, I highly recommend it. The color depth and black levels are just unmatched by VA and IPS panels. And that's a wrap. I'm not going to get into my audio setup or my custom built desk because I'm already pushing 20 minutes here. Special thanks go to AJ Coatney for helping me work through the water cooling and letting me constantly bounce ideas off him about how to make my rig better. Also thanks to Kevin Ebersole, aka Godfather, for the sweet lo-fi jams that hopefully won't get me copyright struck on YouTube and Facebook. And lastly, thanks to my girlfriend Carolyn for putting up with my bullshit when I take up a chunk of our kitchen because I want to take my PC apart to upgrade something. You the best. Anyway, if you've made it this far, I hope you enjoy the video, because it took me a long-ass time to make. See ya!